Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. You know, a thought occurred to me the other day. The thought was that I only say thank you to you, the listener, at the very end of the podcast. So after you've listened to 45 to 75 minutes of content and conversation, I stop and say thanks to you, the listener. But today, I'm leading with that thank you. Thank you for listening, taking time and energy out of your day to pop into this conversation and connect with me and other yoga folks like yourself. This podcast has been such a labor of love for me. When I was teaching yoga in 2016 and 2017, we were all talking in the industry about changes like consent in touch and if alignment was real, and discussing how yoga teachers have a higher rate of hip replacements than the average population. And I was so hungry for these conversations, hungry enough that I started a podcast about it in 2021. What I soon realized was that a lot of the critique culture that we have in the yoga industry space was really just the beginnings of takedown culture. And I also realized quickly that in this conversation, there weren't a lot of people that were also building us up, telling us that our jobs, our profession, what we do matters. So I'm here to do that for us too. Over the course of those yoga teacher training conversations that I'm having on the podcast right now, I want to do both. I want to discuss what we are missing, but also what we're getting right. So if you got input on that, send me an email, rebecca@workinginyoga.com, or sign up for my newsletter in the show notes. When you get the newsletter, you just hit reply and that comes to me. Now this week on the podcast, I'm also launching a new sponsor. The Midwest Yoga Conference, an organization that hosts yoga conferences all over the United States Midwest, and that's where I am in case you didn't know, and has an upcoming conference on October 26th in West Des Moines, Iowa. You'll be seeing me there actually talking about one of my favorite topics, how wellness business owners consider their own wellness while also running a business. And this is complicated and messy, my friends, but we're going to tackle the topic together. The Midwest Yoga Conference is run by Midwest Yoga Magazine, and you can find out everything about them at www.midwestyogaconference.com. Now, this week on the show, I have Erin Ehlers, a friend of mine and a yoga anatomy expert, who is coming to talk with us about what we really need to know about anatomy in our yoga teacher training programs. I absolutely love her perspective, and I'm excited for you to hear it. So let's get into the anatomy weeds, books, coloring books, and giant skeletons with Erin Ehlers. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so this week on the podcast, this is another one in my series about yoga teacher training programs, and I have my friend Erin Ehlers on the podcast with me, mostly because I love her and I want to catch up, but also she's very smart. So Erin, will you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, Rebecca, thank you so much for inviting me on. It's always a treat to connect with you. My name is Erin Ehlers. I live and teach up in Portland, Maine. I've been a yoga teacher for over 23 years. I'm also certified as a yoga therapist, and I'm also a licensed massage therapist up here in Maine. My background in yoga has varied over the years, but primarily I spent a lot of time as a younger student in the system of Iyengar yoga, though I never certified, I never hopped into that lineage. But that has informed for the decades of my teaching a very slow, detailed style These days, I try to emphasize in my classes things like proprioception, building the skills to do asana. And I see people as students, both online and in person. And I also train teachers in a couple of different capacities. I take part in local yoga teacher trainings, and I've also done a lot of continuing ed for teachers in the online space.
Erin is always who I recommend when people say, who does your anatomy and physiology? Actually, I don't even know if I told you this, but I recommended you a couple weeks ago to somebody who was like, do you have people who integrate with your program? And I was like, check out Erin. She's the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I want to, okay, so this idea of anatomy and physiology, I feel like I want to dive into that today as far as yoga teacher training programs go. Partially because you've been teaching for over 20 years. I've been teaching for over 20 years. We were in the industry when we kind of went through this like really wild phase of needing to know every muscle and bone in the body. And like, okay, so can we talk about that? Because I mean, I've talked about this before, but let's talk about it for real. Like, what do you feel like a yoga teacher needs to know as far as anatomy and physiology is concerned?
That is such a fantastic question. So I think of that in the framework of how people usually progress as individuals in yoga, which is these days people encounter classes in some format. They fall wildly in love with yoga. They might do it for a year or two, maybe more. And then they step into a 200-hour teacher training. And I know that there are other formats of doing that, but that's the most common one. So it's often my reference point. And inside of that 200-hour teacher training, there is some education provided about anatomy and physiology. And then they are spit out into the universe to go and teach yoga classes themselves. And that education in anatomy and physiology, it lands very differently in different people, but then also in the different styles in which people might teach and in the context in which they teach. And I have often found that I have the most interest in the classes and courses I offer when it's meant to supplement a new teacher's education. So if someone's only been teaching for 6 months, a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they themselves identify a lack in their education. I don't try to tell people that they don't know anything. I actually give all yoga teachers the benefit of the doubt that we're doing the best we can in a bunch of weird circumstances, that our education wasn't perfect, but it probably suffices for what we're doing. But a lot of people come to me and say, like, I don't think I know anything about the human body, which one is not true. But then it might be that they're encountering this like phase of being a yoga teacher that does actually identify their own shortcomings as a teacher. And I think that's good. To me, it's like, oh, you got through the first few years of nervousness, of obsession over your sequence, obsession over the right words, wrong words to use. And now you're lifting your eyes off of your own notebook, so to speak, or sometimes literally. and you're actually looking at your students. And what you are noticing is, I did all this word craft, I sat on my own yoga mat and I did this stuff myself, but now that I'm saying it to people, it's occurring in a way that I couldn't have predicted or is not what I have requested. And people make this assumption at that point. It's because they don't know enough about what essentially is a branch of biology, anatomy and physiology. And I agree to a certain extent, and then I've got my own, quibbles with that assumption we make. But where people end up is that they realize that whatever they were given inside of their training doesn't actually explain human movement. I think you and I, Rebecca, had a very similar encounter, which was like, here are your flashcards. Here's the anatomy coloring book. Here's, a checklist of things you have to learn. Here's a blank worksheet where you fill in, this is the femur, this is, quadratus lumborum. And that amount of information, I think, has a certain utility, but that usefulness drops off when you are just teaching regular general population classes, because for several reasons. The first one is I never recommend that anyone teaches yoga with a full A&P vocabulary to describe the postures. It's not relevant. It makes you look disconnected. It's not relatable whatsoever. But So we learn this information, but it's essentially like the names of parts. And that's, vocabulary that's useful to the profession. But I think what people don't learn is actually like general principles of movement. So I think we've spent a lot of time emphasizing the memorization of attachment points, the names of bones and muscles, the terminology associated with movement like flexion, extension, rotation, all of that. But what we don't convey are sort of what I think is a more practical idea of like how the body actually operates. What are the expectations you should develop around tendons, ligaments, connective tissue, muscle fiber? And instead, we've sort of obsessed over that's called the lateral malleolus. That's your outer ankle bone, and it's like that's good because I think you as the professional will continue to investigate and research, and you will encounter these words, but it doesn't necessarily make you a better yoga teacher. Sad to say, because I know all that shit, and it's a party. What I always say to people, it's a party trick. Like
it is.
it really is, and it's like I mean, students every once in a while will be like, what muscle is this? And I always say this happened 2 weeks ago in a class I was teaching. We were doing a particular thing. The student was having an experience of like fatigue or engagement. I don't want to name their experience, but they were feeling their outer hip because we were doing something very specifically targeted for the outer hip. And she said to me, what is that called? And I said, if I name it, is that going to make you do it better? Or, you know what I mean? Like, can you perform the asana like more fully? Because I can tell you it's glute medius. And she chuckled because it was with lightness and levity. It wasn't meant as a scolding moment, but it was sort of like, it's a party trick. You can name 640 muscles, you can name 208 bones, you can identify these ligaments and tendons, but if you don't know what it means to use them and operate them and what might limit people, what might give people more access to movement, then it's just a memorization game. So I think it's time to shift.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I know you sometimes are in the online space too, like, and I'll see these on like message boards and yoga teacher places of like, it's anatomy is like the one thing. It's the battle cry of like, we need more anatomy. And I'm like, but what does that mean to you? Like
Yeah.
if I tell somebody to raise their scapula, okay, so first of all, like a third of people will maybe know what you mean, and then the other 2/3 will be like, oh, I see her shoulders moving, like I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. And it's like, you're right. So in the greater scheme of teaching people how to move in space, nobody gives a shit whether it's your gluteus medius or maximus,
right.
or like nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Those distinctions I think should be those distinctions are really for professional conversations. It is not necessarily something I've relied on in order to make my students access themselves better. So I think kind of stepping out a little bit from that is like, you have to identify the purpose in teaching asana. And if your particular purpose in teaching asana is teaching muscles and bones to people, then yes, then include it heartily and readily. Like if that, for whatever reason, the context of what you do, it's important for your students to leave knowing that the lumbricals are what flex the knuckles of the fingers, then by all means, like, I can't imagine what that context is, but like maybe it's out there. But I think for most of us, the purpose of our teaching is not to iterate a scientific terminology quiz. Instead, it's I hear all sorts of things. Like some people teach yoga because it helps them psychologically, it helps them physically, it helps them feel connected. There are social reasons why people go take yoga classes. So really a lot of what we do should be in service of those things, like our higher ideals and purposes as yoga teachers. And knowing the names of parts, I think, is a professional pursuit, but I don't think you stand there in the middle of your classroom and you feel that much more of a better teacher, or your students get that much more of an impact because your language is very scientific. And the caveat on this is, if you took one of my yoga classes, I'm not shy about using this terminology. It's just not the crown jewel of what I'm doing. It's not driving the intent of the class. It just happens to be some of the vocab I pull in because I'm a big geek, I'm a big nerd. People know this, they're prepared for it, but it doesn't make me a better teacher. It makes me a more an anatomically verbal teacher, but it's not better.
Yeah, I think, okay, so let's talk about that nerdiness for a little bit because this is something I think that is pretty, like, it's not 100% universal for us, but I do think a lot of us really just like the nerdiness of knowing, what your bones and your muscles are, and that's cool. Like, I want you to be nerdy, I want me to be nerdy. Oh my god, do you remember that first anatomy book where that guy had like the big human protractor and was measuring like
Yeah.
what percentage of your back is moving in a forward fold and what
Mhm.
percentage of it is your hamstrings? I remember that because that was
Yeah.
even before Leslie Kaminoff's book. It was like one of the first
Yeah.
ones out there, and I
Yeah.
remember like devouring it,
Yeah.
but it didn't make me a better teacher. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm. It might, yeah, it doesn't, the skill of teaching is not simply you have a catalog of information in your brain. Unfortunately, in a teacher training, that's actually what we tell people. Like, if
Yeah.
you learn all of this, then you're better at it. But I think the if you as a teacher trainer are going to emphasize the acquisition of the terminology in anatomy and physiology, then you're you're showing somebody that this is a priority in their learning, right? So it's sort of saying to your trainees, like if you, the trainer, have people and they're coming to you to learn from you, then you're telling these newer or soon to be yoga teachers, this is the important stuff. And I think we should really question that system of values because, I mean, take it from two 20-plus year veterans, it doesn't make me a better teacher. It
Nope.
gives me clearer language in professional discussions and when I pursue continuing education. And when I decide to do some research and I pull up some paper that was written for physical therapists, I have a better ability to read it because I have that background information. But it doesn't help me necessarily in the common context of teaching, which is an all levels, general population, public oriented yoga class. That's how most of us teach. And so, if we're going to train people about anatomy and physiology, I think we have to show them what is actually useful, which I think is generally like movement principles or what is technically known as exercise physiology, which is kind of a bummer because we yogis think yoga stands outside of all these like rules of
I
humanity, but
know.
it's not magic. You are teaching humans to move human parts. So exercise physiology, like how do we acquire strength? What is range of motion? What are the different kinds of range of motion? And it's a little bit about motor learning. Like if you want someone to put their hand there, then how do you teach in such a way? How do you speak in such a way where you actually are like able to convey the skills of movement? So I feel like that's what we should train yoga teachers in. Yes, there's a certain portion of it that has to be acquiring the vocabulary. Otherwise, you can't talk about it.
Yeah.
But like maybe lighten up on that and instead begin to talk about what I have always called movement science or exercise physiology, but basically how the human body moves, which might include something cellular like the sliding filament theory to talk about like how do muscles contract, but actually being able to identify when someone is contracting a muscle, when a muscle is under passive tension, I think is actually a discussion of yoga poses, which is what people sign up for teacher trainings for, is to learn more about yoga, including yoga poses, and not necessarily to acquire this very detailed vocabulary. And, maybe I'm just shaking my fist at previous experiences that I've had, but when I've taught yoga teacher trainings, I try to convey, like, I'm going to start talking to you like you know some of these words already, because I think you've had them float through your mind. I think you've seen them in context. Maybe there's an old, college course or high school class that you might come up with, because I want you to up level and start using this vocabulary as well. But I'm not going to stand here and make you memorize all these things. One of the skills that you get in a teacher training is the understanding that you can go look something up. Like part of education is not just I memorized, the different bony landmarks on the femur, but like, oh, I was thinking about the femur the other day. I felt something in my yoga class. Oh, I've never experienced that before. I'm going to go look that up because it's not finite. It doesn't end when you get your 200-hour certificate. There's no way anyone could teach the totality of yoga in 200 hours, including anatomy and physiology. So it's like step back, look at the principles of learning, look at the principles of movement, and emphasize that rather than the tedious task of memorization.
Yeah, I think one of the things that so one of the things that I like about us having this discussion is that it also reminds me to think back of before this was all just ingrained in my brain, right? Because, 20 years in, I know all these things now. And then I'll be like, but how did I learn that? Like when I first learned and I learned all the bones and where they were in the body and all the muscles and where they were in the body, but didn't like it doesn't mean anything to me if I can tell you about how many bones there are on your wrist if I also can't tell you what the average range of motion is for the human wrist, and knowing that my students will exist in a spectrum of
Hmm.
here to here. And like, it just didn't, I was taught, you're right, that that was what mattered, as opposed to
Hmm.
teaching people how to teach to a human body in movement.
Right.
Like, do we do that differently? Okay, so we take the worksheets out. Let's say we're taking the worksheets out. I take the worksheets out.
Yeah.
How is training in anatomy and physiology way more an experiential kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it really ought to be. And we're so lucky as yogis, like this isn't theoretical to us. This
Yeah.
like, I mean, forgiveness to the yogis who do a yoga that's less emphatic on asana, but the rest of us are pretty much preoccupied with triangle and dog and handstand and
Yeah.
cobra, like pretty much preoccupied with it. So it's fantastic that we put this like side serving of this branch of biology alongside it, but it really is more about what is a reasonable expectation of a human body and movement. And to use your example of the wrist, yeah, you should know what a wrist is capable of in theory, but then you also have to stand in the classroom and say you're going to teach hands and knees and dog pose, you're going to see a variety of capabilities. Most of them are not pathological, some of them may be. And so, really, to get an understanding of what a human body can and does do, and how a variety of human bodies could experience a variety of different outcomes, is actually the kind of asana that people want to be taught. Nobody wants to be taught. There are, I forget the mnemonic device for this, for the memorizing those little scaphoid bones, but
Yeah.
Sam likes to play try to catch her. That's what it was.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
like to memorize the names of the wrist bones. And it's like, I've got that. That's a party trick. I could dust it off. It's in there somewhere. But to me, what is more practical as a teacher is to walk around the room. Oh, there's someone who's really mobile. That person can do more than 90 degrees of wrist extension. Oh, this poor person was talking about common things like carpal tunnel, or they don't do any exercise. They haven't put weight on their hands in 25 years. Like, to get an understanding of how asana operates in the human body, you do need some of those vocab words, but that's not where it stops and starts. It really begins when you can see the variety in human bodies and see how to teach to a very wide potential of outcomes to any particular pose. And I think that is, it's advanced, right? Because you, as the new trainee, say you just signed up for your 200 hour, you might still be really in the thick of figuring this out for yourself and really trying to parse apart, how do I, as a person, as a human, get onto my mat, and what is my experience? I'm loose, I'm tight, I'm strong, I'm weak, all these words we like to attach to our bodies and our asana. We're still in, when we're in a 200 hour, really just beginning to consider all those details. And it takes a long time to kind of, again, like I always say, like take your eyes off your notebook and look at, there are a bunch of other people in the room with you doing that as well. And that's really teaching. Like that's really teaching asana. Before then, you're just kind of muddling through the first couple of years. And that's fine. We all have to do it because it is a new task for all of us. But yeah, the movement principles, just how a human body moves, what the outcome is of any particular instruction could look so different on different people, and how to use a yoga teacher, envelop that in an understanding. Um, and yeah, it's just like we emphasize the party trick, and our understanding of movement is more sophisticated now. And so, like, let's introduce this sophisticated sense of movement science with asana. We might have to spend more time on just learning broader principles of movement rather than just those little details.
So, do you think that the nerdiness about the anatomy is kind of part of the process? Is this like one of our stops? Like
Yeah,
you're
I
in
think, yeah,
3 years and then you get into it, you know?
yeah, yeah, I think so. Because what I've often noted is that when people lose their like some people end up with like this false confidence at first. They're like, they told me I was good. I got the piece of paper. I'm nervous, but this is good. And then they actually look at what happens when they start teaching a class and they're concerned. Sometimes people frame it as a safety concern, which I don't think is a helpful starting point, but I understand that that's where people end up. But they think they have to know more science to teach better. And maybe they do, but maybe they do. And maybe they just also have to shift their expectations of what any group of people are going to do when you tell them to come onto all fours and how you might help them better when that's happening.
Talk to me about safety concerns, because this is such a beef of mine. Like, we're not going to kill people. Like, your knee's fine, your wrist's fine, your hip's fine.
Yeah.
Like, unless you're teaching really difficult asana, unless you're like series 3 Ashtanga, like, people are gonna in general be okay.
Yeah, it's a beef of mine as well, and because I find it so bloody disempowering for both the teacher and the student. And I really resent systems of oppression in all places, but systems of oppression that are aimed towards a population that is largely women, right? So a lot of yoga teachers are women. That's not everybody, but there's a lot of women in yoga. And to then look at them and say, you're not being careful enough is like, wait, is that actually true? You can get hurt doing anything. So that's our caveat, of course. Yes, there's a such thing as a yoga injury, but to assume that everybody in front of you is so frail that if you have any misstep in words, cues, sequencing, alignment, whatever yoga component you can think of, that people are about to fall apart at the seams is radically disempowering. And I understand that the truth of yoga injuries is a real thing. I think we evolved away from that. We evolved away from putting all of our faith and trust into a single person. We evolved away from these lineages that insisted upon this sort of homogeny and outcome to every cue and to every asana. We, for better or worse, I don't see a ton of advanced asana being taught, at least not in my small city, in my small state. There's a lot of newness in yoga. We invited in a lot of new teachers, and they're not teaching advanced asana. So when we're talking about like safety and injury and all that, like the starting point is not, it's going to happen. Watch out. If you mess up even a little bit, you're going to harm people. It's just, if you start to feel that way in your teaching, I'd say like take 3 weeks off and just go take every yoga class you can and come back and see how injured you are and how risky those situations felt. And I would imagine that most of us would come back and say, okay, I feel better about teaching. I just took a bunch of classes. I was the student. I did not feel like harm was headed my way. And I had tons of agency in all of those situations to do or not do. So there's this, the premise is like so faulty. Humans are very resilient unless you are teaching a very specific demographic who are, for whatever reason, prone to musculoskeletal issues, and that's probably not most of us who are teaching those populations. Then your assumption should be that when we have people do difficult or challenging things, there's always a stepwise approach. You don't take the beginner and throw them upside down. There's always a time progression that we can count on, like they're going to be doing this over and over. And that generally this human body is not a system based on fragility and wearing down. Yes, we all age, but the human body in general gets stronger and more resilient through force, stress, and strain. So asana is not inherently dangerous. Of course, there are risks to all of this. That's just the drag about being mortal. But I have always found the teachers who are the most fearful about hurting people have the least amount of belief in themselves and the least amount of belief actually in yoga. And so at that point, I'm like, why are you torturing yourself by standing up there in a state of fearfulness that you're going to harm people? Like, that sounds like sheer torture. You're not paid very well. So like, why do it? Like, why go there?
Paid enough.
You don't get paid enough to like hate yourself. You don't get paid enough to like fear the very thing you're doing. So I always try to, because I have these conversations with people a lot. They think because I know a lot about anatomy, I'm very precise with my cueing, I've got lots of experience, that's a safer class to teach. And I don't know that to be true. I don't. I mean, I could tell you a few stories of things that have happened in my classes over the years. Anyone could who's taught for a long time. And I can also just tell you that like 99.9% of the people who've ever come in and out of my classroom were no worse for wear. So
Yeah.
I think it's just this massive disempowering, and I feel sad on behalf of the people who quickly adopt the assumption that what they're doing is really risky and that people are really fragile. And I feel sad because I think you're going to make your job about 10,000 times harder with no benefit to it.
Yeah. I mean, I this is one of the things I say. Like, this job isn't really that hard. Like, teaching people how to move their bodies in space in
Mhm.
general isn't really that hard. To be good at anything is difficult. But the
Yeah.
basics of like put your arm here, put your arm here, legs go here, tilt your body
Mhm.
this way. Like, you'll be fine. They'll be fine. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's like and you said something about alignment too. Like, I want to talk about alignment a little bit because in my mind, alignment is code for diet culture. Um and
Yeah. Here, here, here,
yeah,
here.
like the same
It's a word I used to use. It was a
yeah,
word I used to
same.
use because of the yeah, because of where we started in yoga. And for a long time, it was a very righteous word. It was very
Yeah.
righteous. As like, there's been evolutions, and I'm sure it's different in different parts of the world, but there was definitely like time when um like hot, strenuous vinyasa was very ascendant. And it's not that it doesn't exist anymore, it definitely does. And the response to that was like, oh, you're so reckless. You're so reckless. You're not even telling people where to put their foot exactly. And if you misstep and put your foot in the wrong spot, you're going to make your students have a hip replacement in 3 years. And it's like, no, that's not possible. It's really, you'd have to be asking people to do very bananas things for the outcome to be guaranteed pain and injury. Again, yoga is not harmful in most situations if you're in the hands of a decent, thoughtful teacher, and people aren't fragile. So, for a long time, it was the watchword for I know more than you. And with my precision and word salad, I'm going to coat you in a protective force field where nothing will ever harm you. And that's bullshit.
Total
uh,
bullshit.
it's total bullshit. Um, Alignment is preference. Alignment is stylistic preferences. It's the things that you believe about yoga. And that's, hey, develop a belief system. I mean, I still teach with when you're in this pose, I would like you to do it in such and such a manner. But the outcome of alignment isn't that you are just going down a checklist. I mean, I don't even use this word anymore, but I know it's still out there. People will say to me, oh, I heard you teach alignment. And I'm like, no, please don't say that. Please don't say
No.
that anymore. But whatever. I'm not going to police people's language. But so when it sounds like I teach alignment to people because they're maybe accustomed to not hearing detail and like long-winded instruction, which is my trademark. Instead, what I feel like I'm doing is telling you how to create action within the pose. It's not just put your foot there. It's like when you put your foot there, raise your arch, notice how that might turn the knee out a little bit. If that is straining to you, then do this in the pose. So it's sort of like I teach a list of actions, like we're doing something in the posture. Yoga is not passive unless it's restorative or shavasana or the passive preferences in yoga. But alignment is really just anybody's particular belief system about how to do a pose. And it is not inherently good or bad. Even people that you say, like, oh, they don't teach alignment. Yeah, they do. They tell you to put your foot forward. That's alignment. It might
Yeah.
be that the person next door says, put your foot forward, and then gives you 8 paragraphs in defense of it. And like also infers all these other things are the outcome of it. And it's like, that's just a stylistic preference. It's just the words that you use to describe how you do a posture. And to think that there is inherently a set of alignment rules that is more proper than anything else is that belief in safe, unsafe, because you have to sign on to something because you think it's superior. And its superiority is often defended as this is safer alignment for you. And I just would have to say to any yoga teacher, you just don't know that. You just don't know that. It might be safer for somebody and it might be irrelevant to someone else. So I think of like there's so many silly examples of this, but for the one that I gave up fast when I started thinking about how bodies move was squaring the hips to the long edge of your mat in
Yes.
like warrior two and triangle pose. It is
Yes.
simply and truly something my hip sockets cannot tolerate. And friends, I can put both feet behind my head. So it's not like I'm some stiff, limited, oh my God, she just needs to stretch more. I do not. But I gave that up under the sense of it made my hip sockets feel kind of used and abused. It was not awesome for my sacroiliac joint, but I do know people for whom when they work to square their pelvis, it's no harm, no foul. But for me, it has a kind of a rotten outcome. So I don't teach it anymore. I teach about 10,000 other things in those poses, but I just let that one fall by the wayside. And I get students every once in a while who will be like, well, where do you want me to face my hips? What do you want me to do with my pelvis? And it's just sort of like, oh, you're waiting for that alignment cue. Well, I said something about your knee and said something about your lumbar. So in the middle of all that is your hips and your pelvis. Just kind of assume something's happening around there. And so it's not to disparage anybody who really has a hard and fast belief system in the superiority of their alignment. I would just say that alignment is not based on anatomical movement because there is no such thing as anatomical movement. Anything you do is anatomical movement. So it's basically based on somebody's perceived truths inside of teaching yoga. And again, I don't like look askance at that. I actually think it's important to develop a belief system about how you teach, but I don't think it should be based on this assumption like, well, I learned it from this person that it has to be heel to heel alignment, or no, it has to be heel to arch alignment, or no, it's pelvic width alignment. Like none of those are all just, they proffer different outcomes to different people. Your job as a skillful yoga teacher is to see those outcomes, to assist people with developing decent outcomes. It's not to kind of hold on tight and squeeze and say, well, the heel to heel alignment is what I learned in 1993 in this workshop with a very famous world renowned yoga teacher. Therefore, it is the proper alignment. Alignment's just a set of ideas and beliefs, and those can be changed. So yeah, that word, I hope it just continues to fall out of fashion, like rapidly disappear from planet yoga, because I think it's very conflicted and it infers this hierarchy of correctness versus incorrectness, safety versus non-safety. And I think those are very limiting beliefs. Nobody wants to hurt their yoga students, but you're not going to not hurt them by saying one thing about your heels or another.
I mean, I'm the teacher who's like deconstructing everything you've heard from everybody else when you come into my classes.
Yes.
So I'm a jerk in that way, but I'll be like, hey, so I know in down dog, you were taught that your feet are supposed to be in this position. And I'm telling you that was made up and you can do whatever the fuck you want because you're a person and you can do what you want. So if that doesn't feel right for you, change it. And that's okay. And I think it's very interesting. I love that this is going to be like the clip from this podcast. Your sentence alignment is preference, because that's what it is. Some people had an aesthetic preference. Some people had an athletic preference. And you were telling people how to position your body based on that preference. It's not like in stone, y'all.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
There's no tablet somewhere.
No, there isn't. And again, I think if you bought into it for a while and you feel like, I don't know if I believe that anymore, that's growth. That's intellectual growth. It's totally great to look back on something you used to believe and say, I don't teach that anymore. There's plenty I don't say any longer. And I consider that not to be like, oh, I bought into some bullshit hook, line, and sinker. I didn't. I just was doing the yoga that was being taught. And it's not that like I'm totally wishy-washy and I'll say 8 different things over the course of 8 months about one idea. I'm not like that at all. But what I do know is that there's a higher skill set, and it actually takes, I think, a fairly long time to get there to actually see the outcomes of any alignment choice. There are people for whom having your feet at pelvic width in downward facing dog is going to give them access to an anterior tilt of the pelvis. Maybe you as the teacher really value that because you're going to do something with a hamstring stretch later on, and this feeds into your creative idea. But you might also have, I mean, I remember taking, was it Shivananda yoga that would do the feet together in dog? I don't remember, and apologies if it's not. And I just remember being like jaw dropping, like, why would you ever bring your feet together, like pearl clutching? And it's like, because that's how they do it. And I actually feel like when I do a dog now with my feet together and I like tinker around with my pelvic position, I get like an interesting outer hip stretch. It's not good, bad. It's not required for me to do anything. It's just a different outcome. So every quote unquote alignment cue that might conflict with another one, they're just different outcomes. And your belief system might be based on one of these outcomes as being preferential, and that's great. But like Rebecca, like you just said, it's not set in stone anywhere. I mean, I've had people say, well, like, that's not anatomical to do that. Well, if your body can do it, it's anatomical. I don't know that you necessarily want to be doing it. The context of the person and their health and about 10 other major contributing factors are really important in that context. But like, it doesn't matter. but
Yeah.
we but it's easier to teach it like to a new teacher. It's like, this is what you should say, and that's fine. Like, hand your trainees a script, because that actually is very helpful for them in years 1, 2, and 3 to teach yoga. But after that, you as the newer teacher then have to kind of parse through, like, oh, do I mean that? Oh, what if we don't do it that way? And maybe one of the most frustrating things for me, or for my students rather, I'm fine with it, is like, as a as a trainer, people give them the same spiel that I've just given you. Like, it's a belief, it's a preference, it's bullshit, everything's a lie, everything's fake. You just have to be an adult and get your way through it. And people will still come up to me and be like, so what should I do
Yes.
with my pelvis in this pose? And
Always.
I'll be like, I just set you free. I just set you free to figure that out. And with the understanding that you will figure something out, because there isn't a right place to do this. And I spend a lot of like energy trying to build up this empowerment, and people still secretly are like, oh, thank you very much, I like that agency, but what do you actually want me to do? So I tell them, I teach, and should anyone take my class, I'm not wishy-washy. I will very much tell you that when we're in all fours, your shins should be pointing straight back. Please don't have your big toes next to each other in all fours pose. And then next week, I will tell you to bring your big toes next to each other when you're setting up an all fours pose. And people like, which one is right? It's like different outcomes. They're just different things to do. But I'm very specific when I'm teaching. I am not one of these teachers who's like, put your hands in all fours, or if you don't want to, you don't have to. Maybe just do child's pose, or if you want, you could leave, or just do Shiva. Like, I don't teach like that at all. I still come across as like, we're doing this. But the bigger purpose of it is not, and now you know the rules of yoga, the bigger purpose is, did you feel your pelvis when your feet were at hips width distance? Did you feel your pelvis when your shins were straight back behind your knees? What was that like about your hip socket? When you pressed your feet down in the pose, were you made aware of the energy that went up through that isometric contraction? It's not because the alignment is the yoga, the paying attention is the yoga. And my job as the teacher is to give you something to pay attention to. Otherwise, stay at home and do your own yoga, but you've bothered to come to my class for some reason. So I'm going to give you instruction, but the instruction is not written on a tablet. And it very well could change in 2 weeks when I decide that that was interesting. Looks like you all got it. Let's try something else.
Yeah. I love this idea, partially because I feel like one of the things we're often not discussing with our students is sensation in the body. And like, if like that to me, I know Erin's got her hands up to the air. Like, that to me is one of those things that's the conversation I'm always having with my students. Like, how does that feel? And I need you to have like a clear gauge of what discomfort versus suffering is. Like, are you uncomfortable? So it's that proprioception, interoception kind of conversation we have. But I'm way more interested in that than I am about where the hell your shins are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, last I checked, yoga was this practice of awareness.
Yes.
we haven't commercialized that out of it yet. Like, we're still insisting like the philosophical underpinnings are true. And essentially it's a practice of awareness. And so one of the tools that I use is like, put your shin there. No, I meant it when I said that, put your shin there. But it's not because your shin is the key to the lock that opens the door to nirvana. It's because the action of you paying attention, and then even better, because paying attention to my words that's not important. That's just, you're in a class, so that's what we're doing. Paying attention to what happens when your shin does X, Y, or Z, linking that to understanding what's been going on in your hip, or just getting a felt sense for once in your damn life of like, oh, my foot's back there. Oh, that's my knee on the ground, or that's my shin, or, oh, you know what? She keeps on saying I could use a blanket underneath my knees. I think I'm going to today. It's really that like felt experience that you're describing, Rebecca, that I think is actually the point of asana. Not to get fit, not to do it right, not to buy in secretly with a lot of code words into diet culture and white supremacy, but to like actually do a practice that makes you develop a way stronger sense of self and to pay attention to the impact of your conduct, whether that conduct is I did X with my shin, or I said this to my spouse, or it's just basically in a practice of awareness. So I actually think proprioception, interoception, exteroception, it's really woefully underrepresented in teacher trainings.
Yes.
It defines most people's experiences. You ask people about yoga, ask them about Paschimottanasana. What do you think of sitting forward bend? Oh, my back is so tight. Oh, I can't straighten my knees, my hamstring. Like people are there to feel their bodies. And it's not too base or gross for us as yogis to do that. That's why we practice hatha yoga, is to be inside of our physical selves. And so give them, like, account for, this is my like shaking my fist, account for your students having a felt experience of the practice. Don't dictate it for them. Don't predict it for them. Don't create a hierarchy. You should feel it here. Don't do those things that kind of get in the way of someone just having a neutral, interested witnessing of their own body in movement or position or relaxation. Like that is, I think, one of the major things that is beautiful about asana, because otherwise I think asana is quite conflicted with itself and with society and with bodies and wellness and all that. But I think one of the gorgeous sort of pure and sacred things about asana is it gives you a chance to witness your own self and just to kind of stand there and have that experience. And you need to account for that in your classes. And there's many different techniques and styles of doing that. But one thing that you should know for sure is that because you told them it was a hamstring stretch does not mean anything to them. They might not experience that hamstring stretch, bendy Wendy over here, or they might have such a searing hamstring stretch, but you're telling them that's important and it's not important to them. Like just let people have a felt experience of their pose. And again, this is not coming from a wishy-washy yoga teacher who just wants to let everybody like feel good and let it all hang out. I'm pretty stringent, but I am absolutely accounting for the importance of them feeling themselves in the pose.
So how do we teach that to our new teachers?
Ah,
How we train that into people? Because I'd rather train that into people than my femurs connected to my, how do we do that?
That's such a compelling question. I would say just in all honesty, I struggle with it, but I am committed to it. I think first and foremost, anybody who is a newer teacher, who wants to become a teacher, who is training teachers, you must be on your yoga mat doing these things. And honestly, if you want to hear my super biased opinion, by yourself, like not with a live stream or a recording, not with the podcast in the background. Yes, please go to classes, but like there should be a fragment of your time devoted to literally just doing your practice so that you have that felt experience. Because if you don't do your yoga with reflection as an internal experience, you will not be able to train people how to do that. So first and foremost, same advice as forever and always for me, like practice, get on your mat and do some stuff. But then beyond that is, again, shifting emphasis. So I shift emphasis away from the supremacy of good sequencing. It's needed, like you should sequence like thoughtfully, but like a good sequence. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank
you can
you.
have that one.
Oh my God. Stop talking to me about your goddamn sequence. Who cares? Like, do whatever you want. Stop it.
Like there's so many interesting ways to sequence. So we'll leave it at that. But that is not going to change your students' physiology all in 60 minutes. It's not going to build them skills all in 60 minutes that they didn't have before they got to yoga class. So even if you love the creative process of designing a sequence, I do. I love it, actually. I really enjoy that part of my week. But that sequence does not bridge the gap between just doing a yoga and being inside of yourself and feeling your yoga practice. There's no sequence in the world. Sequence is an external idea. It's a creative art project. I hope you like doing it. I love doing it. But there's no sequence on God's green earth that's going to develop proprioception for your students if you don't emphasize that. You yourself as the teacher have to keep asking your students questions. You have to keep emphasizing the inquiry. You have to draw their attention to, this might mean that. Do you feel this when that happens? What happens when you do this? So there has to be a large space for the process of inquiry. This is something I really, really believe in. And not just delivering instructions and not just telling people, when you do forward bend, you can protect your back by bending your knees. Okay, next pose. Like, if you're going to say something about an asana, it should include verbiage around, look within, check this out, and not to dictate it for them. Like, I have always resisted that. I think it's one of the reasons why, like, I've rebelled against several systems in my life all along. It's like, I don't want to be told what I'm going to experience. I'd rather just have the experience myself. Like, it makes me feel like a 14-year-old punk rocker again, like, where I want to give authority the finger and start wearing lots of black eye makeup. It's just sort of like, let them have an experience. Your words should leave space for that. And to also just, give them this, like, teach new teachers how to sequence, but also just teach them in the art of svadhyaya, self-inquiry, self-study. And if people keep on looking outside of their own experience for authority, we are just reiterating the systems that we purportedly are trying to reject.
Yes.
So give people the self-authority to say, this works well, this doesn't work well, I really feel this, or this is the outcome of that. And it's not all just preference and opinion. You're actually, like, researching inside of your own practice to figure out what means what. But yeah, I emphasize the art of asking questions, the art of accounting for people's subjective experiences being as important as the objective information. I de-emphasize sequencing as the magic bullet to change someone's tissue or to give them access to a pose that is otherwise inaccessible. And I de-emphasize alignment, and I de-emphasize, I guess those are the main things. I de-emphasize sequencing as being the cure for all that ails you.
That's literally everything, Erin.
Yeah. I was like, what else? No, I think that's it.
All of the things.
Yeah.
But it really is, it's very true. I'm so glad we got on the sequencing thing, because that's something I don't think I've actually talked about on this podcast before, but it's such a goddamn beef of mine. Like, when people come in, we'll be chatting about something and somebody will be like, I'm an expert at sequencing. And I'm like, what does that mean exactly? And I realize, I'm so glad that you called it a creative art project, because I actually do feel like that is something that we can be wildly creative within our jobs. And I love that part of it too. We all come at it a little bit differently. I always build a box. I'm like, okay, so my game is, I want to talk about this thing that's not physical. And I want to talk about this thing that's, like, maybe the game is today. In my head, it's, I want everybody to move their body in every direction over the course of 60 minutes. But today, we're not going to do that on our feet. It'll be all on the floor, and we'll see what happens. Or next time, it'll be only standing up. Can I make people relax while we're standing up? Like, it's the game of creating the outcome that I've decided, based on some other esoteric principle. But it doesn't, like, does it matter whether you do something in like, I don't know. I don't know that I think it does. All these years later, I don't know.
I know.
Mr. Iyengar was right.
Yeah, no, he might have not been perfect. So I remember having this really intriguing workshop that I taught, and I was trying to convey the skill set of taking any pose and just reverse engineering it so you have 25 cool variations. You've got a bunch of new things to say about it. And the group itself was so accustomed to talking about sequencing that they kept on kind of, like, bringing it back to, like, well, if you're going to teach half moon, before that you have to do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, no, like, make this a standalone exercise. I know that's not practical to everyone, but, like, this is an intellectual exercise. And so we kept on getting into the thick of it about, like, yes, we can talk about sequencing some other day. Just kidding, I'm not going to. But, like, today, let's talk about, like, like really looking at a pose and seeing the universe that's inside of it. And so at one point, someone just said, like, getting kind of frustrated with me, being like, okay, I just listened to a podcast, at which point, like, I'm like, oh God, what is this going to be? Like, this could be anything. And she said, this highly esteemed person who's had a podcast for a long time insists that you must teach hip openers prior to back bends. And I said, what an interesting style. What an interesting preference this person has. And she said, but this person gave all the reasons for it. And I said, yes, but the secret reason is that that is their preference. There's no physiological law that requires you to do what? Supta Baddha Konasana, what? A lunge, what? Pigeon? Prior to doing bridge pose, cobra, wheel pose, whatever. Like, I don't see them as not related. And you could certainly, like you were just describing a really cool way of sequencing a class. This nationally recognized important yoga teacher could also lay out a justification as to why this is the way we do it. But it's not a law. It's not illegal to abandon that entirely. When I teach back bends, one, it depends on the class. Two, it depends on the back bends included. I don't think I ever have time to do what you might think of as a typical hip opener stretch or thingy around the pelvis. I just go in a very different direction. And so in this workshop, this was a newer teacher really trying to hang on to, like, oh my God, there's so much bloody information out there. How do I know what to do with it? How do I know how to be the best yoga teacher possible? Yeah. And in my mind, it was just, I just told her, like, if that's compelling to you, hip openers prior to back bends, lady, chase that down the road for 20 years if you want to. Like, I'm not saying it's harmful. Again, I don't think it's like a sense of safety or lack of safety. I'm just saying that you have to know that if you're going to attach to that idea, that it is literally not a fact. It is just someone's preference, and it has worked for them. This teacher that they were talking about is well regarded for a reason. This person teaches great classes. They are an expert in the field. I'm not saying that they're full of shit. I'm just saying that there's a lot that we say in yoga that is truly just a stylistic idea, preference. It's a creative project, but we give it to people as fact. And I think it's time to not do that anymore. Why can't we, as the teacher, as the trainer, as the person conveying our opinion, feel confident enough in our opinions to say, hey, this is a cool thing that I've been doing for, say, the last 25 years, and it works for me. My students love it. I think there's something so cool and jazzy in this sequencing. We always do hip openers before back bends. My students have come to love it. Instead of saying, there's something that must happen in your tissue, not true, before you do a back bend. Because inside of that is, your back bend has to be awesome. And I have found the most direct route to you achieving a desirable outcome, which again is diet culture and white supremacy in disguise. So why not just do hip openers before back bends? Because that's my preference. I've taught it that way forever. It works for my body. It works for 75% of my students. First of all, I have to define what a hip opener is. Second to that, then what back bend are we talking about? Like, it's all just style and preference, and that's fine. But people have to package it as factual to grab their little sliver of authority and to maintain their own inner sense of self, their sense in their community of having value and whatnot. It's like just time to call the preferences the preferences and just be like, if you like that other idea, go study with that other person. But if you're in my classroom, I'll say, interesting, show me how that works. Show me what you like about it. I'll cheer you on unless you're doing something really wacky. I'll just say, keep up with it, teach it 75 more times, come to me on day 76 and tell me what you think about it. Just an experiment. Like, it's just an experiment.
So the final thing I want to ask you, this idea.
Why? Because we've been talking for 5 hours?
No, because I feel like everybody listening is totally going to be like, how do I get a hold of her? And I want to make sure that we have time for you to tell people how to get a hold of her, because this is amazing. This idea of preference versus the value that we offer people. So yeah, so there's a gravitas behind me saying to you, Erin, you must teach, to use your example, hip openers before back bends. I sound like I know what I'm saying when I say this is what it's supposed to be. There's a gravitas behind that, like, seriousness of that. How do you combat that when you're just like, hey, we're running on vibes today, which kind of like, you know what I mean? Which is, I'm going to be honest, that's how I teach. We're running on vibes today. This is how I feel.
Yeah. Sounds like that's your preference.
It is my preference. I just say it with a serious big girl voice, and then people listen to me. How do we do that? Like for that new person listening, where they're like, but how are my students going to take me seriously if I tell them it's a preference situation?
You don't have to announce that. You don't have to stand up there. I mean, like, hey, everyone.
Don't tell them the secret.
The secret. I would say you have to justify what you teach. You don't have to justify it with authority, and you don't have to justify it with lack of authority. Like when I teach my classes, and I have just generally a couple going on in person every week, I don't start the class with, hey, I got my reasons for this, but today we're going to do this. I just tell them what to do. And I don't feel that I have to waste their time or mine in providing them a thesis statement for it. I think 23 years in, my classes sort of stand on their own. I do give levity in the class. I try to be a fairly humorous teacher. I try to get people to laugh once or twice. I try to give them like points of like salty challenge where they might start to resent coming to class, but then like a minute later, they're doing something soft and sweet. So I let the practice stand on its own. But when I try to look within and re-examine my purpose in teaching, I just have to practice that level of honesty and say to myself, I do this because I prefer it. When I train people, it's a little frustrating to them because I'm actually asking them to become critical thinkers instead of paying me anywhere between like $50 and several $1,000s to learn what to say and what to do and the rights and wrongs. I'm actually just trying to like be their companion in a practice of self-discovery and critical thinking and asking brave questions, stupid questions, obvious questions. Like I'm just trying to be their companion as a trainer and let that unfold, because there isn't a finite point where this needs to land, because there's, in my purview, there's no hierarchy, there's no perfection, there's no, now you're a good yogi, now you're a bad yogi, no, you can't do this pose, so you're not doing too well. So for me, it's like really trying to reverse engineer a lot of this internalized hierarchy on everything in our culture, and just giving people the ability to develop their preferences as a teacher, and to make them feel like they're solid in their sense of self. They don't have to justify it to other people. I mean, if there's somebody making you justify your teaching, they're not going to be your student for very long. Just let them go.
Ooh, yeah. Erin, tell everybody how to find you.
Okay. Well, I'm in Maine. Come visit me. Maine is the most gorgeous state in the union, especially in the summer. I currently teach in person a couple times a week at an amazing studio called the Portland Yoga Project. And they have a wonderful location. They're a radically inclusive studio. It is super fun to be there. I also teach online with live stream classes on the regular weekly. And I do a good variety of continuing ed courses for yoga teachers online. And so you can find all that information at erinehlersyoga.com. So those would be the best venues to search me out.
And you're just going to come back and we're going to talk about online teaching another time, because I totally want to talk to you about that too.
Yeah, we're just going to start the infinite podcast, and it just starts one day and like a decade later it's over.
Yeah. Perfect, because that is my preference.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thank you so much for coming to have this conversation with me, Erin. Here are our key takeaways. First, there is a need to move away from the coloring books and flashcards that we associate with anatomy training in yoga, and into a better understanding of how movement works, away from the anatomy and perhaps toward the kinesiology, so to speak. Next, consider what practical knowledge you need in order to facilitate a yoga class. As Erin says, being able to rattle off intricate bones and muscles is a nice party trick, but what do you need to know in order to be better and more skillful as a teacher in your yoga classes? Because the overwhelming majority of students in your classes are never going to know which metatarsals do what. Next, I literally applauded out loud when Erin called out the fact that our obsession with injury in yoga spaces is incredibly problematic and disempowering, especially considering the fact that the majority of our participants, both teachers and students, are women. Women's bodies are strong and capable. Women are smart enough to know what they want to do with their own bodies. Full stop. It is not our job, nor the government's job, to police women's bodies. Next, alignment is a stylistic preference, not a hard set of rules of how to properly teach a yoga pose. Also, diet culture. Yoga's alignment is a dog whistle for diet culture and how some people's bodies are quote unquote better than others. And finally, sequence is not supreme. Oh wow, did I throw my hands up in the air when Erin said this? Experience over sequence, my friends, forever and ever. Sequencing is a wildly creative process, which is satisfying, but there is no one set way to do it. Now, next week, we're going to hear an interview with my friend Hannah, who trains teachers and has a whole host of advice for us about how we train our students and teachers. You are going to love it. Thanks again to Midwest Yoga Conference for sponsoring the podcast. Check them out at www.midwestyogaconference.com. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I am so grateful that you're listening. I will catch you around the water cooler next time.